Chihuahua, Mexico, 1931. Police forced open the door of a sweltering boarding house room. The scent of bitter almonds hit their lungs. On a stained mattress lay a man, his features locked in a rictus of agony. Beside his rigid hand rested a drained glass of cyanide and a worn, open Bible. He chose the most violent poison on earth to end his suffering alone in the dirt. Who was this broken drifter? And what nightmares chased him into this shallow grave? Chihuahua, Mexico, in the winter of 1931, was not a place of refuge. It was a purgatory built of cracked earth, relentless wind, and the hollow echoes of desperate men chasing elusive veins of silver and gold. On the night of January 3rd, the wind howled through the unpaved streets, carrying the grit of the mines and the faint scent of stale tequila. Inside a modest, shadow-draped boarding house, thousands of miles away from the paved boulevards and flashing cameras of Los Angeles, a grim supper unfolded. The dining table consisted of scarred, rough-hewn timber. A single incandescent bulb cast wavering shadows across the peeling wallpaper. Sitting at this table was Acord, sharing a meal with the local mine manager and his wife. The air in the room possessed a suffocating weight. Acord did not speak of his past triumphs. He chewed his food in a mechanical silence. His eyes, once bright and commanding on the towering silver screens of America, now mirrored the dead shafts of the surrounding Mexican mines. The fragile facade of the dinner shattered in an instant. Acord reached a calloused hand inside the pocket of his worn coat. He pulled out a transparent glass vial and placed it with gentle care on the center of the wooden table. The glass clinked against the wood, a defining sound that froze the breath in the room. The liquid inside was potassium cyanide. In the unforgiving economy of rural mining, cyanide serves a violent industrial purpose. It is a toxic, corrosive agent used to strip flakes of precious gold from tons of useless rock. It is also the most efficient executioner available on the black market. The pungent odor of bitter almonds seeped through the cork, reaching the nostrils of the manager and his wife. Panic seized their throats. They understood the lethal mathematics sitting beside the dinner plates. The couple abandoned their meal. They leaned across the table, their voices rising in a frantic chorus of pleas. They begged the former star to hand over the vial. They offered breathless platitudes and hollow promises of better days, urging him to look past the crushing darkness of his current reality. Acord sat motionless, letting their panicked words wash over him like rain hitting a stone monument. He watched their terror with a detached silence. Then, shifting his gaze, he offered a thin smile. He picked up the vial, slipped it back into the dark pocket of his coat, and muttered a quiet reassurance. He promised he would put it away. He pushed his chair back from the table, offered a polite nod, and walked down the creaking hallway toward his rented room. The manager and his wife exhaled a nervous breath, believing they had managed to talk a ghost off a ledge. That fragile illusion held for exactly 1 hour. 60 minutes of ticking silence. What happens inside a barren boarding house room during the final hour of a man's life? The walls offer no answers. The silence in the hallway morphed from a relief into a blaring siren. The manager, unable to shake a creeping dread, approached Acord's door. He knocked. Nothing answered but the howling wind rattling the loose window frame. He knocked harder, his knuckles bruising against the cheap wood. The silence stretched, turning thick and ominous. He braced his shoulder, took a breath, and forced the door open, the rusty metal hinges screaming in protest. The scene inside the room resembled a macabre still life arranged with meticulous care. The sickly, sweet scent of bitter almonds hit the manager like a physical blow, burning his eyes and choking his throat. Acord lay collapsed on the scarred floorboards beside a sagging mattress, his body seized in convulsions of a violent nature. His limbs thrashed against the hard wood, fighting a losing biological battle for oxygen. On the rickety nightstand nearby, a heavy glass tumbler sat empty. A milky white residue clung stubbornly to the inside of the glass. Resting mere inches from the tainted tumbler was a worn, leather-bound Bible. The book lay open, its fragile pages fluttering in the draft, leaking from the cracked window. The visual juxtaposition arrested the eye. The instrument of agonizing self-destruction placed with deliberate intent beside the symbol of divine salvation. It formed a haunting portrait of a man torn between the desire for eternal peace and the cold necessity of a violent exit. A local physician was summoned from the freezing night. He burst into the room carrying a black leather medical bag filled with tools that were useless against this specific enemy. Cyanide does not offer a drifting sleep. It executes a systematic shutdown of the human machine. The poison binds to the enzymes within the cells, preventing them from utilizing oxygen. The lungs heave, pulling in massive gulps of air, but the cells suffocate. The victim drowns on dry land, experiencing the agonizing sensation of internal asphyxiation while the mind remains conscious. The doctor dropped to his knees on the wooden floor, his hands working with frantic speed over the convulsing frame, attempting primitive methods to purge the stomach, fighting a battle lost the moment the glass touched Accord's lips. The physical struggle stretched through the darkest hours of the night. Accord's frame, the same body that once wrestled giant steers and survived trench warfare, withered under the chemical assault. Then, a moment of clarity pierced the frenzy. The convulsions paused. Acord opened his eyes. The pain-induced delirium faded, replaced by a sharp focus. The doctor leaned in close, expecting a desperate plea for a miracle, a gasp of regret, or a mumbled prayer for forgiveness. Acord stared at the water-damaged ceiling above him. His voice, once capable of commanding attention in crowded theaters, rasped through a chemically burned throat. He did not ask to be saved. He did not cry out in fear. He spoke with a chilling certainty. He whispered to the doctor that his desire for death was a deliberate choice. He had orchestrated this pain. He welcomed the dark. He lingered in that localized hell for a few more hours. As the first gray streaks of the morning sun broke over the harsh Chihuahua horizon on January 4th, the struggle ceased. The heart of the cowboy stopped beating. The Mexican authorities arrived soon after, stepping into the foul-smelling room with clipboards and indifferent stares. They saw a dead drifter, just another forgotten casualty swallowed by the poverty of a harsh mining town. They documented the vial, the glass, the open Bible, and the stiffening corpse. But the man rigid on the floorboards was not a nameless vagrant born to the dirt. He was a fallen titan. The crime scene, the poison, the scripture, the agonizing final whisper, demands a forensic autopsy of a spectacular ruin. How does a man forge himself into a celebrated symbol of American strength, surviving the mechanized slaughter of the First World War and conquering the silver screen, only to swallow poison of his own free will in a cheap, rented room thousands of miles from home? What sequence of events dismantles a legendary life, stripping away every layer of hope until a glass of cyanide becomes the only acceptable escape hatch? The answers do not lie in the Mexican dirt, but in the glittering machinery of an industry that built him up, only to grind him into dust. The Utah sun bakes the earth into cracked clay and unforgiving stone. In the late 19th century, the frontier offered no mercy to its children. Born into a rigid Mormon settlement, Acord learned the mechanics of survival through calloused hands and blistered skin long before he learned to read a script. The West was not a romantic, painted backdrop. It was a daily war for existence. Before he reached voting age, he descended into the claustrophobic darkness of silver mines. He swung iron pickaxes against solid rock, breathing in toxic dust, his lungs burning in the damp subterranean air. Above ground, he drove herds of longhorn cattle across miles of waterless scrubland. He slept on the hard ground, using his leather saddle as a pillow, listening to the howl of coyotes in the pitch black. The desert elements tanned his skin into thick hide. Decades of back-breaking manual labor packed his frame with functional muscle. He did not learn how to play a cowboy from theatrical directors in comfortable city studios. He swallowed the frontier dust, sweated under its sun, and bled directly into its soil. He was a product of the dirt. This savage landscape birthed the primitive theater of early American rodeo. Before corporate sponsorships, safety regulations, and padded arenas sanitized the sport, rodeo served as a raw proving ground. It was an arena where men pitted their fragile flesh against the furious power of nature. Acord did not just participate in these spectacles. He ruled the dirt rings. He pioneered the dangerous discipline of steer wrestling, known then in the cattle camps as bulldogging. The sport demands a suicidal calculus of timing, leverage, and sheer kinetic force. A rider must spur his horse to a dead sprint, matching the speed of a fleeing, panicked animal. Then, operating in a split second, he leaps through the air, abandoning the safety of the saddle. He seizes a 1,000-pound steer by its razor-sharp horns. He digs his boot heels into the dragging dirt, twisting the massive neck, and drags the beast to the ground using nothing but leverage and raw momentum. One mistake results in trampled ribs or a gored chest. Acord mastered this violent ballet. He claimed the World Steer Wrestling Championship in 1912, and he dominated the arena again in 1916. Crowds roared as he slammed colossal animals into the earth, establishing physical superiority over the beasts of the plains. His reign over the animal kingdom reached its mythic peak the day he faced Steamboat. In the early 20th century, Steamboat was not just a horse. He was a nightmare wrapped in black muscle. The bucking bronco carried a notorious reputation across the western states. The animal was famous for snapping spines, shattering collarbones, and crushing the skulls of anyone foolish enough to mount him. He was considered unrideable, a force of pure equine malice. Acord accepted the mission. He walked into the cramped wooden chute. The beast snorted, kicking the timber walls, white foam gathering at its mouth. Acord gripped the thick braided reins, wrapped them around his scarred hands, and nodded his head. The gate swung open. The horse exploded into the arena. It twisted, kicked, and thrashed with lethal force, attempting to launch the rider into the sky and trample him into the dust. Acord held his grip. He absorbed the bone-rattling impacts, his spine snapping like a whip with every buck. He anticipated every movement of the animal beneath him, matching its fury with unyielding human stubbornness. He broke the unbroken horse, conquering the monster of the rodeo and cementing his status as a living Western legend. That kinetic energy refused to stay confined within the wooden fences of the arena. Acord carried a storm of bravado everywhere he walked. He sought the thrill of physical confrontation with an appetite that bordered on the surreal. When he crossed paths with Tom Mix, another rising giant of the Western entertainment sphere, they bypassed polite introductions and Hollywood pleasantries. The two alpha males collided in a bloody brawl. They traded heavy blows, cracked knuckles on jawbones, and settled their unspoken rivalry in the dirt, proving to the onlookers who held the true title of the toughest man in the room. His thirst for combat pushed him into bizarre territories. In a display of fearlessness, he once stepped inside a makeshift ring to fight a live kangaroo. It was a punishing spectacle of early carnival entertainment. He dodged disemboweling kicks from the animal's hind legs and traded bare-knuckle punches with the beast, laughing in the face of physical danger. He lived on the razor edge of adrenaline, an untamed force of nature who believed his own flesh could withstand any punishment the world could deliver. Then, the rhythm of his life fractured. The First World War erupted across the ocean, turning the green pastures of Europe into a slaughterhouse of mud, rusted barbed wire, and artillery craters. When the United States mobilized its forces, the nascent film studios offered safe assignments for their stars. They wanted their handsome cowboys safely stateside, selling war bonds and posing for patriotic recruitment posters far away from the shrapnel. Acord rejected the safety net. He walked away from the cheering crowds, traded his Stetson hat for a steel combat helmet, and enlisted in the United States Army. He crossed the Atlantic and marched directly into the rat-infested trenches of the Western Front. The brutal environment of his youth had prepared him for the nightmare of mechanized combat. He knew how to suffer the freezing cold of the winter trenches. He knew how to ignore gnawing hunger and exhaustion, amidst the deafening thunder of mortar shells and the creeping terror of mustard gas. Acord stood firm. He fought with the same ferocious spirit he used to conquer the rodeo beasts. The battlefield offered no scripts and no stunt doubles. Men died in the mud beside him. During the chaos of battle, he performed acts of valor that defied human self-preservation. He charged through enemy machine gun fire, navigating a hellscape of shattered trees and buried landmines. He risked his own life to secure strategic positions, cutting through barbed wire entanglements to pull his wounded brothers from the mud. He met the horrors of modern warfare with the raw courage of the old frontier. The French government, witnessing his bravery on their shattered soil, recognized the American cowboy. They pinned the Croix de Guerre upon his military uniform. This medal remains one of the highest military decorations awarded by France for supreme courage and heroism in the face of the enemy. It is a symbol forged in blood and sacrifice. Acord sailed back to the shores of America, not merely as a famous entertainer pretending to be tough on a movie set. He returned as a decorated, legitimate hero of the Great War. When his boots hit the docks of New York, the public beheld a genuine phenomenon. They were accustomed to seeing pampered actors wearing makeup and clean boots, men who relied on camera tricks to look dangerous. Acord possessed a chest full of medals, a body carved from stone, and a spirit tested in the deadliest conflict in human history. The scars on his hands came from holding bucking horses and gripping barbed wire, not from signing autographs. He embodied the peak of rugged patriotism and invincible American strength. He brought the visceral reality of blood, dirt, and gunpowder into the manicured world of the 20th century. He stood at the summit of the world, a fearless titan forged in the fires of battle and the dust of the plains, ready to conquer the silver screen with an authenticity that no studio could ever manufacture. The Roaring Twenties offered a neon-lit playground for a soldier sprinting away from the ghosts of mechanized slaughter. The American film industry traded the blood-soaked mud of the Western Front for velvet ropes, sprawling mansions, and blinding Klieg lights. Prohibition choked the rest of the nation, but Los Angeles operated under its own arrogant laws. The city ran on smuggled gin, frenetic jazz rhythms, and the unregulated wealth generated by celluloid dreams. Universal Studios spotted a walking gold mine stepping onto their dusty backlots. They handed Art Acord a lucrative contract, pushed him in front of the hand-cranked cameras, and yelled action. Directors fired the stunt doubles. They dismissed the acting coaches. Acord rode galloping horses through narrow, dangerous canyons. He threw punches with bone-breaking force, bringing the grit of the frontier to the polished silver screen. He churned out over 100 short films and thrilling cinematic serials, working at a breakneck pace. He dominated the box office weekend after weekend. The American public devoured the raw, unpolished charm radiating from the theaters. His name eventually found a permanent home, etched into the brass and terrazzo of the Hollywood Walk of Fame. The studios handed him vast wealth, global adoration, and undisputed star power. The world lay at his feet. But the City of Angels specializes in feeding hidden monsters. The brutal transition from surviving deafening artillery shells to navigating elite socialite parties snapped a fragile wire inside his mind. The horrors of trench warfare do not vanish when a director calls cut. To silence the lingering echoes of exploding mortar shells and the screams of dying men, and to manage the crushing pressure of global fame, he sought refuge in the booming illicit narcotics trade. Bootleg whiskey became his daily water. He drank straight from heavy glass bottles, chasing the burning liquor with copious amounts of marijuana. He spiraled further down the rabbit hole, experimenting with the harder substances flowing freely through the hidden VIP rooms and locked bedrooms of Beverly Hills. The stoic, disciplined military hero vanished into a cloud of pungent smoke. A volatile, unpredictable addict took his place. The poison, rewiring his brain, hijacked his physical strength. The same muscles that wrestled massive steers to the dirt and fought enemy soldiers in the trenches transformed into a blunt weapon. The ticket-buying public idolized a righteous sheriff who always saved the helpless and upheld the moral law. His wives lived behind locked oak doors with a tyrant. The domestic reality of Acord was a suffocating nightmare. It was a world defined by the sharp sound of shattered glass, frantic screams echoing through empty hallways, and bruised skin hidden beneath thick layers of Hollywood makeup. 3 separate marriages buckled and collapsed under the relentless strain. His wives fled the opulent homes in terror, driven away by his unapologetic infidelity and his sudden bursts of rage. He dragged the women who loved him through a private, inescapable hell. The man who earned prestigious medals for supreme bravery on European battlefields terrorized his own family inside luxurious estates. It is a stomach-churning paradox. The celebrated hero of the silver screen morphed into a monster in the dark. He destroyed the lives of those closest to him while millions of naive fans cheered his giant face in the theaters. The studio executives knew about the broken furniture. They saw the terrified wives and covered up the dangerous benders. But in the ruthless mathematics of the Hollywood machine, moral bankruptcy is forgiven as long as the theater seats remain full and the money keeps flowing. The studio fixers swept the domestic abuse under the rug. They bribed local police officers and intimidated journalists to protect their valuable asset. The system enabled his darkest impulses. They provided endless streams of cash and insulated him from the consequences of his actions. He was surrounded by sycophants and yes-men who applauded his destructive behavior, isolating him from genuine human connection. The hero of the West was trapped in a gilded cage of vice, decaying from the inside out while the cameras kept rolling. Yet, human nature refuses simple, comfortable categorizations. You cannot paint a man purely as a villain when the core of a savior still beats beneath the toxic layers of addiction and cruelty. A visceral flash of this buried nobility erupted during the chaotic filming of the silent picture Lazy Lightning. The director demanded a tense, dramatic scene located near the precipice of a steep, jagged California cliff. The drop plummeted hundreds of feet into a rocky canyon below. A young child actor, confined to a heavy wooden wheelchair for the specific role, sat waiting near the precarious edge. Dozens of crew members bustled around the set, kicking up dust, adjusting heavy arc lights and cranking the cumbersome wooden cameras. The sun beat down on the dry earth, creating a stifling, tense atmosphere. Then, a horrifying accident unfolded off-script. The loose dirt beneath the wheelchair gave way. The heavy wooden wheels slipped backward, losing traction on the crumbly stone. Gravity snatched the chair, pulling the helpless, screaming child toward a fatal plunge. Panic paralyzed the film crew. Grown men, hardened grips, and veteran directors froze in terror. They watched a nightmare happen in real time, their feet glued to the dirt, unable to process the impending tragedy. Acord did not freeze. The alcohol-soaked fog clouding his brain evaporated in a fraction of a heartbeat. Muscle memory, forged in the unforgiving rodeo rings of Utah, took command of his nervous system. He spotted a coiled lariat resting on a nearby prop saddle. With an instinctive motion honed by years of steer wrestling, he grabbed the rope. He did not hesitate to measure the distance. He threw the lasso. The braided rope snapped through the dry air. The wide loop caught the plunging wheelchair just inches from the edge of the abyss. The rope pulled taut with a violent jerk, arresting the momentum of the heavy wood and metal. Acord dug his leather boots deep into the dirt, creating a human anchor. He braced his shoulders against the heavy pull of gravity. The rough rope burned the skin off his palms, tearing through his thick calluses, exposing raw flesh and blood. He ignored the pain radiating up his arms. Hand over hand, muscle tearing against the strain. He hauled the heavy chair and the terrified child back from the brink of certain death. He pulled them over the jagged rocks to the safety of solid ground. He saved a life, silently coiled his blood-stained rope, and walked away from the stunned, breathless crowd without waiting for applause. This singular act of physical salvation exposes the agonizing tragedy of his existence. He was a fractured, leaking vessel. He inflicted immense, unforgivable pain on his partners, yet he delivered miraculous salvation to a stranger without a single second of hesitation. He harbored a demon that destroyed his home, but he retained the reflexes of an angel when a life hung in the balance. Examine the surviving grainy photographs of Acord from this turbulent era. Look past the handsome jawline, the tailored suits, and the styled hair. You do not see the hollow, vacant stare of a simple thug. You see striking blue eyes, laced with the broken blood vessels of chronic alcoholism and sleepless nights. Those bloodshot eyes scream with a suffocating loneliness. He was a man trapped in a relentless war against his own rotting soul. He searched for peace in the bottom of gin bottles and in the arms of fleeting strangers, finding only deeper layers of pain and isolation. The Hollywood elite threw deafening parties to celebrate his box office triumphs, but no one knew how to save the savior. He drowned in plain sight, surrounded by wealth and adoration, desperately waiting for an executioner that would eventually wear his own face. The internal rot eating away at his mind eventually manifested as a brutal manifestation of bad luck. In the bitter winter of 1928, the universe delivered a blow that nearly ended his suffering prematurely. An invisible, silent leak allowed volatile gas to pool inside the rooms of his home. The source of the ignition remains buried in police reports, but a stray spark found the concentrated fumes. The resulting explosion ripped through the structure with deafening force. The blast wave shattered heavy glass windows, splintered door frames, and turned wooden furniture into lethal, flying shrapnel. The shock wave caught Acord head-on, throwing his frame across the room like a discarded rag doll. Searing heat scorched the skin of his face and burned the delicate tissue of his eyes. Paramedics rushed the broken cowboy to a sterile hospital ward. Nurses wrapped his head in thick layers of white gauze. He lay in the pitch black, breathing the sharp medicinal scent of iodine, facing the prospect of permanent blindness. For a star of the silent era, the eyes are the primary engine of communication. A silent actor speaks volumes through a tortured glance or a widening of the pupils. Losing his sight meant an irreversible execution of his livelihood. The doctors worked with frantic speed, peeling away the bandages weeks later to reveal a scarred, shaken man. His vision slowly returned, blurred but functional. He survived the fire. He walked out of the hospital doors believing he had cheated death. He failed to realize a far more ruthless, efficient executioner waited for him back at the studio gates. Technology moves with the cold, unfeeling precision of a falling guillotine blade. While Acord suffered in a darkened hospital room, audio engineers invaded the Hollywood backlots. They bolted heavy metallic microphones to the rafters of the sound stages. Warner Brothers released a film with synchronized dialogue, and the cinematic landscape fractured overnight. The era of pantomime, of expressive faces and exaggerated physical stunts, suffered a sudden death. The studio conglomerates demanded dialogue. They demanded crisp, theatrical voices, capable of captivating a changing, modern nation. The advent of the talkies was not a gradual transition. It was a brutal, overnight purge of the old guard. Acord faced the microphone. It was an enemy he could not intimidate with his fists. It was a machine he could not wrestle into the dirt or shoot with a prop revolver. The studio executives forced him into a soundproofed room for a mandatory vocal test. The red light flashed. Acord opened his mouth and delivered his lines. The recorded playback sealed his fate in a matter of seconds. The rugged, towering titan of the western frontier, the man who tamed wild horses and survived artillery barrages, possessed a voice that simply did not match his imposing physical architecture. The tone lacked the required theatrical gravity. It broke the constructed illusion. The studio executives listened to the audio reels spinning on the playback machines. They performed a cold financial calculation. They did not care about the millions of dollars he had generated for their company over the past decade. They did not care about his military service or the rodeo championships. The men in tailored suits voided his lucrative contracts with a stroke of a fountain pen. They ordered the studio security guards to lock the iron gates and instructed the casting directors to erase his name from the ledgers. They threw him out onto the pavement. The massive entertainment industry he helped build from the dirt up discarded him without a single glance backward. The financial dominoes began to topple with unstoppable momentum. The calendar turned to 1929, and the American stock market collapsed, acting as a perfect mirror to his personal devastation. The streams of studio revenue evaporated overnight. The leeches, the sycophants, and the fair-weather friends who drank his liquor and populated his parties vanished into thin air. The relentless financial demands of his previous divorces, his crippling substance addictions, and his years of unchecked, extravagant spending had drained his bank accounts dry. Creditors swarmed his remaining assets like buzzards circling a dying animal in the desert. The banks foreclosed on his properties, changing the locks on his doors. The expensive tailored suits began to fray at the cuffs. The man who once commanded a vast celluloid empire stared at empty accounting ledgers. He was a king without a kingdom, a cowboy stripped of his land, left with nothing but a thirst for alcohol and a gnawing need for cash. Hunger forces desperate men to abandon their moral compass. The United States operated under the strict, suffocating laws of the Volstead Act. The federal government banned the production and sale of alcohol, inadvertently giving birth to a violent underground economy. Acord, a man accustomed to writing his own rules and living on the razor edge of adrenaline, stepped willingly into the shadows. The famous actor who spent a decade playing righteous, law-abiding sheriffs transformed into a real-life outlaw. He plunged into the dangerous, murky waters of the bootlegging trade. He traded his silver spurs and studio makeup for the steering wheel of unmarked cars with reinforced suspensions. He navigated treacherous, unpaved back roads in the dead of night, his headlights switched off to avoid police patrols. He transported heavy wooden crates of illicit, homemade whiskey across state lines. He dealt with ruthless syndicate bosses, desperate smugglers, and armed thugs. He risked his freedom and his life for a fistful of dirty, crumpled bills just to survive another week. The hero of the silver screen was reduced to a petty criminal, running contraband through the dark. The law always catches up to a falling man. Police officers raided his illegal operation, smashing the wooden crates and spilling the illicit liquor into the dirt. The steel handcuffs clicked shut around the same wrists that the French military had decorated with the Cross of War. Authorities dragged the former Hollywood idol into a sterile, unforgiving courtroom. He stood before a municipal judge, stripped of his protective public relations team and his cinematic aura. He was just another desperate criminal standing in the dock, shivering in a cheap suit. The judge slammed the wooden gavel against the sounding block. He pronounced a guilty verdict and handed down a standard fine for the offense. The penalty was $150. In the Roaring '20s, Acord dropped that amount on a single round of drinks at a speakeasy or handed it to a valet parking his sports car. Now, standing in the harsh fluorescent light of the courthouse, Acord searched his pockets. He felt the coarse fabric of his trousers. He found nothing but lint. He did not possess $150. He could not leverage his fame to secure a loan. He had burned every bridge and exhausted every favor. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow to the stomach. The crushing humiliation burned his throat, choking him. The pioneer of the rodeo, the hero of the trenches, the global star of the silver screen was officially destitute. He possessed a net worth of $0. Facing the grim prospect of rotting inside a cramped, filthy jail cell for a petty smuggling crime, the shattered idol made his final, desperate choice. He refused to let the public see him behind iron bars. He turned his back on the justice system, turned his back on the country he had bled to defend, and hit the road. He chose the life of a fugitive, running south toward the border, carrying nothing but the heavy weight of his own failure. South of the border lies a sprawling, sun-scorched purgatory built for desperate men. For decades, American outlaws running from federal warrants, insurmountable debts, and their own shattered reflections have crossed the Rio Grande, seeking an invisible cloak. The rugged, lawless expanse of Mexico serves as the traditional graveyard for the unwanted and the hunted. Art Acord joined this grim parade of ghosts. He slipped past the border checkpoints, leaving his country behind, and vanished into the unforgiving landscape of Chihuahua. This destination offered no cinematic romance. It possessed no velvet ropes, no flashing cameras, and no forgiving studio fixers to clean up his messes. Chihuahua in the 1930s was a hard, dusty reality of survival. The glittering Los Angeles skyline, with its sprawling mansions and endless parties, faded into a distant, unreachable mirage. The hero of the silver screen was now a nameless fugitive, breathing the dry air of exile. The cruel symmetry of his life closed its jaws with terrifying precision. He began his youth swinging a heavy iron pickaxe in the dark, dangerous silver mines of Utah. He fought his way out of the dirt, conquered the world, and now, stripped of his fortune and his fame, the dirt reclaimed him. He descended into the deep, unstable mining shafts of Chihuahua. He did not work for vast wealth or corporate profit. He labored for bare, primal survival. The local mine bosses offered him a brutal transaction: backbreaking physical exertion in exchange for a sagging cot in a squalid boarding house and a daily plate of tasteless, starchy food. The sensory shift was merciless. He traded tailored silk suits for coarse, sweat-stained canvas, the hands that once signed thousands of glossy photographs for screaming fans, the hands that gripped the steering wheels of expensive sports cars, now gripped splintered wooden tool handles for 12 hours a day. Rock dust coated his throat and settled deep within his lungs. He swung the heavy pickaxe against the unyielding stone, jarring his bones with every impact. The brutal, subterranean labor dismantled the legendary physique that had captivated an entire nation. The thick, functional muscle wasted away, replaced by the gaunt, hollow frame of a starving laborer. The golden boy of the silent era became a grimy, anonymous worker, sweating in the pitch black, swallowed whole by the earth. When the grueling shifts ended, the real nightmare began. The physical agony of the mind paled against the psychological torture of his fall. To numb the crushing weight of his reality, to silence the deafening roar of his own failure, he turned to the cheapest, harshest liquor available in the border cantinas. He poured raw, unrefined tequila down his throat, desperate to drown the memories of cheering crowds, beautiful wives, and studio executives. The relentless barrage of toxic alcohol accelerated the rot taking hold of his brain. His mind fractured. The sharp, commanding intellect of the rodeo champion dissolved into a muddy haze. He began to suffer from severe memory loss, drifting into dark, confusing voids where the past and the present bled together. He sat alone in the dark corners of smoke-filled bars, a ghost haunting his own failing mind. He mumbled disjointed stories about Hollywood movie sets, wild horses, and French battlefields to local patrons who neither understood his English nor cared about his past. His striking blue eyes, once the focal point of massive movie posters, glazed over with a dull, vacant stare. The alcohol stripped away his remaining sanity, leaving behind a hollow shell of a man trapped in a loop of fading memories. The delusion of past grandeur clung to him like a parasite. He could not accept the brutal reality of his own poverty. In a pathetic, heartbreaking attempt to resurrect his dead empire, he played a dangerous game of pretend. He asked skeptical cantina owners for a pen and a scrap of paper. With trembling hands, he scrawled his famous signature, a signature that used to command thousands of dollars, across the bottom of worthless personal checks. He handed over these fraudulent pieces of paper to pay for his cheap liquor and meager meals, acting as if the studio bank accounts in Los Angeles still existed. He wrote checks backed by nothing but air, denial, and faded glory. The ink dried, the checks bounced, and the fragile illusion shattered. The angry merchants demanded their money, exposing the raw, humiliating destitution underneath his performance. The local Mexican police force did not harbor any reverence for cinematic history. They did not see a decorated war hero who bled in the trenches of Europe. They did not see the pioneer of the American rodeo or a star enshrined on the Hollywood Walk of Fame. They saw a nuisance. They saw a pathetic, aging American drunk causing disturbances and defrauding local businesses. When the bad checks piled up and the drunken ramblings turned into chaotic, pathetic outbursts, the authorities stepped in without hesitation. Officers dragged the former titan of the entertainment industry out of cantinas by the collar of his dirty shirt. They threw him into cold, concrete holding cells to sleep off the liquor. He spent his nights shivering on filthy jail floors, surrounded by local petty criminals, reeking of stale booze, unwashed sweat, and urine. The man who wore the Croix de Guerre for supreme bravery, the man who dined with the elite of Beverly Hills, was reduced to a local joke. He was a petty vagrant swatted away by bored border cops. The Hollywood machine had extracted his youth, his talent, and his sanity, leaving the husk to rot in a foreign jail cell. He hit the bedrock of the human experience, stripped of every ounce of dignity, a discarded monument crumbling into the Mexican dust, waiting for the final push into the abyss. Step back across the threshold of that Chihuahua boarding house. Ignore the howling Mexican wind rattling the loose window panes. Focus the lens on the physical evidence scattered across the scarred wooden floorboards. Criminal investigators do not merely look at a corpse, they read the physical space like a final, desperate confession. The primary theory, the narrative initially pieced together by the grim reality of the room, points to a self-inflicted execution, a calculated suicide. To accept this verdict, we must conduct a meticulous psychological autopsy of a shattered mind. We must measure the precise weight of a stolen identity. Acord did not just lose a lucrative job. The Hollywood studio system stripped him of his fundamental reality. For over a decade, his reflection in the mirror belonged to a towering, invincible icon. Millions of theatergoers validated his existence every single weekend. When the microphones of the talkie era arrived, they did not just silence his career, they erased his persona. The transition from a global hero to an obsolete artifact requires a grieving process. Acord lacked the emotional tools to grieve. He was a product of a harsh frontier and a brutal war, a man conditioned to suppress pain and project unyielding strength. When the strength failed, he medicated the profound loss with cheap liquor and dangerous contraband runs. Consider the sheer psychological velocity of his fall. A man who wore the cross of war on his chest and saw his name carved into Hollywood brass was reduced to begging for grueling mining shifts in a foreign desert. The human ego possesses a breaking point. Prolonged exposure to absolute destitution, compounded by severe alcoholism, creates a toxic, inescapable landscape within the brain. Clinical depression does not merely cause temporary sadness. It distorts the fundamental fabric of reality. It builds thick walls around the sufferer, blocking out all light and leaving only a suffocating, echoing chamber of past failures. Acord sat in that dark, cramped room night after night, listening to the ghosts of his former life. The applause of the rodeo crowds, the sharp commands of film directors, and the angry shouts of his ex-wives merged into a relentless, deafening roar inside his skull. The physical arrangement of the crime scene supports this grim narrative of total surrender. Look at the small, rickety wooden nightstand. A forensic profile of a suicide often reveals the victim's final state of mind through the specific objects they choose to keep close in their last moments. Acord placed the lethal glass of cyanide mere inches from a worn, leather-bound Bible. This juxtaposition is not a random accident of a dying man. It is a deliberate, theatrical tableau. It is the final silent scene directed by a former master of the silent era. The cyanide represents the unbearable physical and mental pain. It is the violent exit strategy, a tool to stop the relentless noise in his head. The open Bible represents a final, desperate plea for grace. It is the physical manifestation of a man seeking divine forgiveness for the wreckage he left behind, acknowledging his profound sins while simultaneously committing the ultimate transgression against his own life. He orchestrated his demise with the dark precision of a tragic stage play. He shared a final, tense supper with the mine manager, a macabre rehearsal showcasing the lethal vial, before returning to his room to face the end alone. The local medical examiner arrived to process the chaotic aftermath. Bureaucracy always demands a neat, categorized explanation for death, regardless of the messy reality of the crime scene. The Mexican authorities looked at the empty liquor bottles littering the corners of the room. They looked at the gaunt, weathered, jaundiced face of the deceased, They scribbled their official conclusion on a piece of government paper. The initial death certificate lists the primary cause as cerebral congestion due to alcoholism. It is a sterile, clinical phrase that fails spectacularly to capture the agony of the preceding decade. Cerebral congestion suggests a swelling, a fatal pressure within the skull brought on by years of punishing drinking. Medically, the prolonged abuse of hard liquor deteriorates the brain tissue and weakens the vascular system. The coroner determined that the chronic poisoning of his own body laid the physical groundwork for his sudden collapse. The authorities treated him not as a fallen king of the American cinema, but as just another tragic statistic of the borderlands. They viewed him as another broken drifter whose heart and mind simply surrendered to the bottle. They stamped the file, closed the case, and prepared the body for a quiet, unmarked grave in a foreign cemetery. This official verdict forces us to confront the terrifying gravity of irrelevance. The entertainment machine creates gods of flesh and bone. It places them on towering pedestals built of celluloid and public adoration. But when the technological winds shift, the machine knocks those same gods into the dirt without a second thought. The sudden fall breaks their bones, but the subsequent enduring silence destroys their minds. Acord survived the mustard gas and the machine guns of the European trenches. He survived the crushing hooves of wild rodeo stallions and the brutal demands of frontier life. But he could not survive the deafening, suffocating silence of being forgotten by the world he helped entertain. The poison in the glass merely stopped his physical heart. The cold, relentless indifference of a changing era had already killed his soul years before he crossed the border into Mexico. The official narrative constructed by the Mexican authorities demands blind faith in the fragility of a broken man. The suicide ruling requires us to believe the iron will of the soldier who survived the trenches simply evaporated in the desert heat. But when the news of the cyanide glass reached the frantic, rumor-fueled streets of Hollywood, the men who actually knew the cowboy rejected the coroner's stamp. Stuntmen who bled beside him in the rodeo rings, directors who witnessed his explosive temper, and fellow actors who shared his bootleg whiskey scoffed at the suicide note. They recognized a fundamental flaw in the psychological profile. Acord possessed an ego the size of a mountain. He was a fighter, a brawler, a man whose primary instinct in the face of disaster was to throw a punch, not swallow poison. The tight-knit fraternity of his former life offered a radically different, terrifying alternative to the official story. They alleged a massive, bloody cover-up. They pointed their fingers toward the dark, corrupt shadows of the borderlands and whispered the word murder. When an American celebrity meets a violent end on foreign soil, especially in an era defined by brutal cartel violence and corrupt law enforcement, the official paperwork often masks a deeper, darker agenda. The Mexican authorities held zero incentive to investigate a high-profile homicide. A murder investigation requires resources, attracts unwanted international press, and disrupts the quiet, lucrative flow of local corruption. A suicide, however, is clean. It requires minimal paperwork, closes the file quickly, and allows the dusty town to return to its secretive business. This inherent distrust of the foreign legal system forces us to examine the alternative facts, the buried clues that point directly to an orchestrated execution. The first thread in this dark tapestry involves a classic, timeless motive for violence, a fatal romantic transgression. Acord, despite his crushing poverty and severe physical decline, retained a dangerous, reckless charisma. He was a man accustomed to taking whatever he wanted, regardless of the consequences. Rumors began to circulate through the underground channels of Chihuahua that the fallen star had ignited a passionate, illicit affair. The object of his dangerous affection was allegedly the wife of a powerful, entrenched local politician, Or perhaps a ruthless figure operating within the shadows of the mining syndicates. In the rigid, unforgiving social hierarchy of 1930s Mexico, public humiliation by a washed-up foreign drifter demanded a violent, immediate response. A man of significant local power does not challenge a rival to a fair duel in the town square. He utilizes his influence. He hires silent professionals. The theory posits that the enraged husband orchestrated a meticulous, untraceable assassination. The assassins located Acord in his vulnerable, inebriated state. They staged the scene, arranging the glass and the Bible to create the illusion of a desperate, remorseful suicide. The cyanide, a common chemical easily procured from the local mining operations, provided the ideal, swift weapon. It circumvented the loud, messy complications of a gunshot, ensuring the local police would draw the easiest, most convenient conclusion. The second crucial piece of evidence pointing toward homicide abandons the messy realm of passion and focuses on the cold logic of financial greed. The brutal mining operation that employed Acord operated on the fringes of legitimate commerce. It was a harsh, exploitative environment where human life held little value compared to the heavy sacks of extracted silver. Just weeks before his agonizing death, Acord mailed a desperate letter back to a close associate in the United States. The letter contained a staggering revelation. Acord claimed that he was not merely surviving on scraps. He stated, with conviction, that the local mining bosses owed him a massive, substantial sum of money for his brutal subterranean labor. He was demanding a payout that would provide the necessary capital to finally escape the squalor of Chihuahua and attempt a resurrection of his life. This correspondence transforms the narrative. He was not a man preparing to die. He was a man aggressively fighting for a future. The conspiracy theory suggests that the powerful men controlling the mining operations performed a ruthless calculation. Settling a massive debt with a discarded, universally despised American vagrant hurt their bottom line. It was infinitely cheaper and significantly easier to permanently silence the creditor. The mining syndicate possessed the means, the motive, and the direct access to the lethal cyanide used in their daily industrial extraction processes. They allegedly dispatched enforcers to the boarding house on the night of January 3rd. They confronted the isolated, weakened actor. The chilling, horrific scenario paints a picture of violent coercion. The assassins forced the chemical down his throat, neutralizing the threat to their finances while simultaneously staging the perfect, unsolvable crime. But what about the final damning piece of the puzzle? What about the chilling, raspy confession delivered to the terrified local doctor in the early hours of January 4th? The official record states that Acord explicitly claimed he wanted to die. This admission is the cornerstone of the suicide verdict. However, when viewed through the lens of a staged execution, the dying words take on a new dimension. Cyanide does not offer a gentle fading of the senses. It induces massive neurological trauma, violent convulsions, and severe delirium. The human brain, starved of oxygen and burning from the inside out, hallucinates wildly. The agonizing whisper could easily be the meaningless rambling of a man lost in a chemical nightmare, misconstrued by a doctor desperate for an answer. Alternatively, the confession might hold a darker, more terrifying truth. If ruthless assassins physically overpowered him, forced the burning liquid down his throat, and watched him writhe in agony on the floorboards, his final statement might not have been a declaration of suicidal intent. It might have been a desperate plea for the pain to finally end. He did not want to die when he sat down for dinner that evening, but after hours of enduring the most excruciating physical torture imaginable, the sweet release of death became his only remaining desire. The official ruling demands we accept a simple, pathetic surrender. The alternative narrative forces us to confront a brutal, calculated murder, leaving a chilling, unresolved shadow over the dusty grave of a forgotten American hero. The true architect of the Chihuahua tragedy remains a ghost. Whether Art Acord swallowed the poison to escape his own relentless demons, or whether hidden assassins forced the burning liquid down his throat to settle a debt, the immediate aftermath presented a brutal, undeniable reality. The local Mexican authorities prepared a shallow pauper's grave. They possessed no interest in preserving a legacy. They planned to drop the cheap wooden box into a nameless, unmarked trench in the foreign dirt, letting the desert consume the evidence of his ruin. A titan of the American frontier faced eternal erasure, but loyalty outlives manufactured fame. When the grim news crossed the border, a dedicated handful of old friends and the solemn members of the veterans of foreign wars refused to abandon a brother in arms. They pooled their meager funds, paid the necessary municipal ransoms, and claimed the fallen soldier from the morgue. A steam train carried the heavy casket north. The rhythmic clatter of the iron wheels traced a slow, somber path across the vast desert, bringing the broken cowboy back toward the California sun. The massive studio conglomerates ignored the train arrival. The powerful Hollywood executives threw no lavish memorials for their discarded box office king. The red carpets remained rolled up in storage. But a different, far stronger brotherhood stood waiting at the station platform. A United States military honor guard stood at rigid attention. The military does not measure a man by his fading star power, his illicit bootlegging runs, or the wreckage of his broken marriages. The nation honors the blood spilled in its defense on foreign soil. They carried the cowboy to his final resting place with quiet dignity. Rifles fired a crisp, synchronized salute into the still air, the sharp cracks echoing across the cemetery. A lone bugler raised his instrument and played the mournful, echoing notes of taps over the draped casket. The eternal, sacred title of a veteran washed away the heavy sins of the fugitive. Art Acord found his peaceful sanctuary not under the bright, artificial glare of studio lights, but under the forgiving soil of the country he fought to protect. The applause faded long ago, leaving behind only unpaid debts and shattered lives. What are your thoughts on the harsh lives behind the fame? Leave a comment below. If you like this video, hit subscribe to join us behind the scenes of hidden legends. Thank you for watching and goodbye.